Blade first came to us, I think as a pitch from a director named Ernest Dickerson, who wanted to adapt it. And then I met with the guys from Marvel at the time. It was this fellow Joseph Calamari, and he had mentioned that LL Cool J wanted to play the character, and we started talking about it on that level. And I think David Goyer came in on the pitch with Ernest Dickerson, and we started doing a deal for it. And then David went off to write the script, and eventually it grew into this bigger movie, mostly because of the script David wrote. He wrote a really good first draft, and he kind of got the attempt to kind of follow in the footsteps of the first Batman movie. So the first draft convinced us that it should be a larger film, and it kind of sat around with us for a while, and we were exploring different actors. And then Wesley Snipes was frustrated with the progress on Black Panther, which is another comic book adaptation in development at Columbia, and he freed up and read our script and liked it a lot, and then it kind of went from there. And then Ernest was off doing something else, so we were looking for another director, and it led us to this guy Steve Norrington, who made this low-budget movie that was very well shot and well directed in terms of action, and we all thought he was the right guy for the job, and kind of got Wesley wanted to do kind of a take on Hong Kong action films and Hong Kong martial arts, and it incorporated well into Blade's universe.
I think that Norrington, maybe his worldview is perhaps a little bit of a comic book view, but it's bigger than life. It's more extreme. The colors are denser. The blacks are darker. The shadows are deeper. He sees, almost like in scope. And even though the aspect ratio of a comic book is certainly not scope, it's 1:3:3. I mean, they're squares. Norrington sees very graphically, very visually, and he tells a story visually. There's a lot of Goyer's explanation in the movie, but what really moves the story along is the visual storytelling.
We had ideas about a program where Frost would keep people in cold storage for his bloodletting, so a human blood bank, in other words. So we took literally blood bags, elongated them, put people inside of them, and gave a concept of initially what would be one body bag as a starter program, inevitably being a factory of blood holding body bags, keeping these people in a state of cool, and would be able to pull actually store and feed off of these people while keeping them alive. It's part of the story point that actually was removed from the picture.
How'd you get that scar, Deacon? A born vampire would have the power to regenerate from birth. You must have gotten scarred before you were turned. Isn't that right? Vampires like you aren't a species. You're just infected. A virus, a sexually transmitted disease.
I'll tell you what we are, sister. We're the top of the fucking food chain. And the blood tide's coming, and after tonight, you people are fucking history. It's a hurricane. An act of God. Anyone caught in its path will instantly be turned. Everyone you've ever known. Everyone you've ever fucking loved. It won't matter who's pure blood and who's not. How you gonna cure the whole fucking world? And Blade's blood is the key. We've been trying to kill this guy for years. He turns out to be our salvation. That's the beauty of destiny.
If you turn everybody into vampires, whose blood are you gonna drink?
Come with me. Neat, huh? I can keep him alive for years, producing anywhere from 10 to 15 pints of blood a day. Of course, this is just a pilot program. Once the tide comes, we're gonna have to step up production.
You're disgusting.
Why? Because we live at another species' expense? It's called evolution. Survival of the fittest.
We've got an intruder.
Beautiful.
Endings are really important. If you have a great movie and your last 10 minutes aren't so great. I mean, they're really important because it's the last impression that people are, you know, that you leave with people. You can have a spectacular movie and fail the audience in the last 10 minutes and completely lose them. On the other hand, you can have a movie that doesn't start out so great, and as long as it ends on a strong note, people will forgive quite a bit. Endings are very important. And I don't know why, but typically they are the most difficult thing to write. They're the most difficult thing to film. In quite a few of the films I've been involved in, there have been multiple endings. Part of the reason is you never know what you're going to get when you make a movie. You never know which performances are going to pop. Things that work really well on the written page just end up working horribly, you know, on screen, and vice versa. You have no idea, and so you can think a scene will play, you know, excellently, and when it's cut together, it's just flat and dead as a dog. And conversely, you could be really worried about a sequence in script form, and then it ends up being brilliant, and it turns out not to be a problem at all. And it's always, there's always a sense of discovery when you watch a film for the first time, and you never know what you're going to get. I mean, writing a script is not the same thing as making a movie. The script is the blueprint, and it goes through an evolutionary process.
In the original script, we had this ending with Lamagra. Stephen Dorff's character, Deacon Frost, would turn into this big... I think originally, actually, he calls forth this big blood monster that would be like a Lovecraftian monster. And then we kind of, before we shot the movie, decided that he himself should turn into Lamagra. But we all kind of thought, it's a little cheesy, this big blood thing, conceptually. And we saw actually like still animatic shots of it. We never really thought it was that great, but we thought maybe it'll work. So we kind of went into it a little doubtful. And then eventually it just looked like this big jello thing, you know. And once, in the test screenings, once the audience got hooked into Stephen Dorff, the minute he was not Stephen Dorff anymore and became this faceless, gelatinous, you know, gloopy mass, they just checked out of the movie. You know, they sat there patiently and waited for the end, but they just really were into Dorff as a villain, and the minute he was off screen and became this thing they couldn't relate to, it got really silly. So we panicked and scrapped the whole thing and decided to do a new ending that kept Stephen, you know, the villain, because that's what they really liked. So I think it was a conceptual flaw from the beginning. We always thought it was a little sketchy, but it might work, but we never really addressed it, and then we paid for it in production.
You're too late, Blade. The sleeper has awakened. You want my blood so much? Take it! Are we having fun yet, Blade? I sure hope so, because after I'm done with you, I'm gonna fuck the whole human race. I'm not Frost anymore. I'm the plague of darkness. Anyone I touch will be turned. Fucking pathetic. What? You see him? Can't help you now, stud. I feel sorry for
you. Who said it was syrup? It's not over, Blade. Your problem is...
Blade! Thought I'd be so happy to see the sunrise. I need to get back to the lab if I'm gonna cure you.
It's over. You keep your cure. I've never felt better. Besides, as long as there's a war going on, I still have a job to do.
Oh, yeah? Then you're back on the clock.
We never talk about sequels because it's kind of a jinxy thing to do. And we're never sure. Like, we do just deal with the one movie and trying to make it the best we can. And then if it works, there's a whole bunch of factors about sequels, including whether the guy wants to return and do another movie, the actor or whatever. So
there's no question that New Line and Wesley and, you know, a lot of the people involved hope that Blade will spawn, you know, no pun intended, another New Line film, other sequels or, you know, TV show or who knows what. It really didn't affect what we were doing when we were creating the film. Obviously, the big question to me will be, I mean, Blade is a very graphic, violent, dark movie. And the big question to me will be if a second film is made, will it be more user-friendly? Will it go the Batman route? I mean, I was very disappointed with the Batman films. I thought they got successively worse. You know, if there's going to be a Blade Happy Meal 4 or 5 years from now, I think we're in trouble.
The production design process begins with my meetings with Stephen Norrington to decide what he wants in the film. Ultimately, he's the designing chief of this whole thing. It's his image, his vision, and my job is to give him and bring that and then add to that if I can. To begin that process, we work with conceptual illustrators, and I was blessed to have a great team of guys, each having their own style, and each we would focus and guide to use his style to our advantage or to his advantage. One of the guys, Tani Kinatani, has a wonderful style, very clean, very slick, and he was very good with lighting and mood, and he was wonderful in helping me to design and figure what would the world of Frost be, or the vampire be. We would begin with location photos of existing locations, research photos that I would gather, and I'd bring them to the table and we'd talk about it, and we'd have to find a camera angle that would really work. The most important piece to this is that these things can be done. Other guys were very good at weapons. Mark Messenger was instrumental in creating not only the storyboards for the film, but a lot of the weaponry. He has a wonderful style of mechanics and cleanliness to really be able to cleanly have something built. His designs are quite wonderful. In another way, Patrick Janicki's work was instrumental in bringing life to the motorcycle and a lot of the other sets and weapons that we had. His work is very bold, very flamboyant. He's very much involved in the motorcycle culture, so he knew his mechanics terrifically. He would give us different views that we could actually take these images, take them to a company that would create this machine, and they could work off of and sculpt off of these images as well as architectural plans for each one of the bikes. We designed Blaide's vehicle. Initially, it was hard, really coarse, rough. We changed inevitably, knowing Wesley's character, to a really very slick. Blade wouldn't let the car be damaged, really. It was a little bit too much to have a blower and those kind of elements, so we wanted to become very realistic. And ultimately, Steve Norrington himself was a genius in using Photoshop and his illustration ability to let me know what concepts that he would like to do. We brought him Balinese tattoos, and he took a photo of Wesley and literally sat down and over the course of a half an hour created this image, which was so dramatic and so radical that it became part of Wesley's character, and it really was wonderful. We developed weaponry together. We had issues with once you design a weapon or when you do architectural design, sometimes the illustration is wonderful looking, but when it is built, there are problems. So what we ended up doing is taking real machines, real mechanics, putting them in Photoshop, and adjusting to very specific machining requirements. This was given to a prop manufacturer and was built exactly as this image was drawn. So that is the hero weapon prior to its manufacturing. Finally, all this work that we do before the filmmakers step foot on stage really is meant to excite the studio, is to get an impression, a mood, and have everyone on the same wavelength when we come together. There's 120 some odd people, plus now with visual effects teams, that are on the same page. We all have to kind of make the same movie, and I'm fortunate enough to be the ringleader. I get to begin that process with the director, creatively coming to a wonderful visual storytelling medium.
So it was about 2 years ago we began Blade, and I had known Steve Norrington, the director, from 15 years ago. We worked together on Greystoke, which Rick Baker was the head of, and so I've known Steve for many years, and I've seen him off and on. I've gone over to England and saw him working on some of the Henson films, and he was creating all these incredible makeup effects and everything. And also Bob Engelman, who's the producer, I did The Mask with. He produced The Mask with Jim Carrey, so I knew both of them really well from when this project started. I had talked to them about just doing the Pearl makeup, which was the huge vampire in the film, because of the budget restraints and everything, and I said, you know, it'd be really fun to do the whole project if I could. And I hadn't done a fun vampire film in a long time, because I did The Lost Boys way back, 10 years ago. And I really enjoy working on those kind of films when I can. This was based on a comic book, so you can take a lot of license with this kind of vampire film. Coppola's makeup in his film, I tried to do very gothic and subtle, and you know, it was a whole style I tried to do. It's like The Lost Boys. I tried to do a whole style with that. I based the whole makeup on the contact lenses I designed. And Joel Schumacher was very adamant that he wanted to keep them very beautiful looking, these young people, and the teeth should look like pearls. So I did a very subtle, really beautiful teeth for that. For this film, I really, you know, it had to be violent in places. It had to really, you know, it had to have a different style, but you could have a lot of fun with it. So you could do big teeth here and there because it didn't have to make perfect sense in every scene on what happened with it. So you have a lot of license with this kind of film because there's a lot of humor in the film, you can have fun with it, and some parts should be overdone a bit, you know, to make it work for that scene.
Rita, is that you? He's here! He's here!
This must be Pearl, the record keeper.
The Pearl character, Steve wanted this huge, massive vampire, and he would just sit there and he couldn't move. He'd been there for hundreds of years, and they would bring him young kids to feed on and blood packs to drink out of, and he ran the computer thing and guarded the door to the vault of the info of the vampires and everything. And that was the big makeup, even though it was a very short part in the film, but it was a lot of fun because it was, you know, we'd never done anything this big before. So we figured out about a pound, how many pounds he should weigh, like about 1,500 pounds or something. And then Miles Tevis did a drawing of this huge thing, which was very round. And then we gave that to Steve, and then he put it on the computer and stretched the whole thing out. So it was this massive, much heavier than we imagined. And we all looked at that and went, yeah, that's the way it should be. And Steve liked it a lot. So that's what we used to go off of, was a stretched version. The character for Pearl was played by Eric Edwards. And this poor guy, we had to get him and put him in a chair and cast him in the position sitting on this chair, because when we built the final thing, it was going to be this massive puppet. And we had 5 actors inside of it. We had the actor with his head out the top. We had an actor for an arm over this side, an actor way over here for the arm on that side, and we had puppeteers working the feet inside. We made it out of silicone. We wanted it to be very translucent, so we poured a huge amount, I think it was like $7,000 worth of silicone into this massive mold to make this skin that was very fleshy. And then we had to do the makeup that blended down onto the neck of him with Eric in the side of this. So what we'd have to do is we'd do makeup on Eric with the makeup, which took myself and Steve about 3 hours to do. And then we'd fit him in there, and we'd have to finish the whole makeup. So once he was in it, he had to stay there. And it got very hot, and we had air conditioners running inside this body and all this activity and TV screens inside the body, and it was pretty funny. And then we had a giant bladder they were standing on in the back, making the chest go up and down. And we're trying to get some movement to it. The trouble with something like this is we didn't have enough time to really work out so we could get more movement out of it, which we really wanted to try to do. But in the video, Steve did some computer-generated bits of the body moving and that, which looked pretty neat. So that was a huge amount of work, and just they had to basically build a moving trailer, which this was built on and molded on, so that it was all sculpted on. The trailer was moved somewhere else. The mold was made on it. It was brought back, and then we made it, and then it was on the trailer. It was shipped down to the studio, where a hydraulic lift then had to take it and set it onto the stage, the whole body unit, and work it into the set. And it was a massive undertaking for this creature.
He moved.
What we wanted to do in the action in Blade was to incorporate a number of martial arts that had a hard style to it, a soft style to it. Blade's character, we wanted to have him more on a fluid side, and which would encompass both hard and soft. And for Frost, who plays the bad guy, we wanted him to be more straightforward and direct, and that fell to a Japanese or hard style. The inspiration for this was from a film that I like a lot, and was Sword of Doom. In that film, you see the ultimate cut slash fighting with the katana. We checked out a few other action films that had some good sword play, and from that we did everything we could to stay away from the seemingly popular Hong Kong action films, and try to bring out our own rawness, basically.
Get him over to this side, you'll say, or whatever, just like, bam, bam. So you're just beating the shit out of it. And like, she's like, she's the one who brings it back up again. She's like, bam, and she like, so you're taking him out, you know what I'm saying? Like you both sort of, ultimately, you know. Yeah, sword goes from there, big, sword goes down. And she's like, stab! Watch it, buddy. Stop! Fuck her. And then he starts running away like, and she's like, there's more. Shit. She's like standing up now. Huh? Okay. What? She's standing up, but the train is right there. Yeah, but she's pulling herself out. Maybe you haul her out. Haul her out. Standing like this. We can have a hold out. Tidy. Okay. This is your vision. I'm with you 100%. Yeah, right. I'm with you. So,
There's a reason that you do special effects work in the first place. It was determined that it was far too dangerous and too expensive to shoot a sword fight in a real subway tunnel, a real subway train tunnel, while there was a 60 or 80 mile an hour train passing through that was just a few inches from the, Wesley Snipes and the rest of the actors. Ultimately, the decision was made to build a section of subway train tunnel on the stage out in Canoga Park to film the fight sequences over green screen, and then to introduce a computer-generated, fully synthetic subway train into the tunnel while the fight scene was going on. The production bought 3 subway trains. They actually had them on the lot, up on blocks. And they were using them for interior scenes that were taking place inside that subway train after my sequence was finished. And there was a couple of exterior shots I think that they used them for, but it was fortunate to have them around because I had a perfect model available to me for a computer simulation. So I hired Viewpoint Data Labs to fly in from Utah and do a surveying on the subway train, and some weeks later they provided me with a very accurate computer model of one of the subway trains in its entirety. The roof, the walls, the interior, the wheels, everything. And so what happens is that by hand, this, on a frame-by-frame basis, this train is moved around horizontally, vertically, and they're slid along a track. You can rotate them. Change the camera. Also, the camera, that's the
the object that controls the position of the train, but you can also move the camera around. If we're to lower the camera, then the train goes up. If we move the camera to the right, the train goes to the left. If we move the camera back, the train goes away. So this object here behaves just like a real camera. And in fact, we can even insert a lens value here that will simulate the lens of the camera in terms of millimeters or inches. You can do camera rolls. So the idea is to use these controls to be able to position the train relative to the background on a frame-by-frame basis. And there are schemes that have been devised to use sort of automatic methods of camera tracking the background. We tried some of those, but ultimately decided that it would work better and probably work faster if we just eyeball the whole thing. And you can see that the camera bounce has all been programmed into this. The train is bouncing around the same way that the tunnel is. So now we're going to whip pan around and follow the train. There we go. And that scene, you can actually, the camera's actually looking inside the windows of the train, and you can see the little cutouts that I have of the people, and see there, right there. Those are the folks. Now, without the pictures in the background, the thing plays back a little faster. You can see all the people that are in there. And there's a texture map of all the little stills that I took. That's me, actually, right there. I think that one is me. The train is moving really fast, and the motion blur takes the curse off of a lot of the detail that's in there. And so I decided that just sticking sort of cardboard cutouts almost of these people at a particular view, either the side view or front view or sitting down, and just taking that cutout that was there, that image, and just putting a control in it so that as it passed by, it would always face the camera. Because if I didn't do that, at some point it would go edge on and it would just disappear. So I had a rotation going in on each one of the characters as it was going by. And it serves to give the illusion that there's some population in there. If you really went single frame through there and examined the train very closely, you would see stuff that doesn't look right in there. But to get the illusion of people populating the interior of it worked just fine. This train, we were thinking originally would travel at about 60 or 70 miles an hour, and it just looked too fast. When you start speeding things up, they also start to lose mass. They look like toys at some point. So we slowed the train down, and it began to look heavier and more menacing. And so we ended up at a speed of about 40 miles an hour. Here we're going to break right through it. So we're actually inside the train here, car number 1. And like I said, we didn't use this part of it, but it was kind of fun to play around with it on this level. This film was in production for nearly 2 years, and there was a ton of effects work, and some of it was sort of in flux as the film was progressing. And in addition to the 28 shots involved in the subway train sequence, there was a variety of more modest projects that came up, and some of those were offered to me, including a couple of slow motion bullet shots that are fired out of Blэyd's gun. But at one point in the new ending that they designed for it, there was some more blood that was required. And so they came to me, and we came up with a design for it, and about 3 weeks before the negative was due, I took on the job and really got into it, and turned out 2 really high density scenes of very difficult liquid animation.
Hey, Blade! Let's do this.
One is where Blade swings around and slices Frost through the abdomen, launching the upper part of his body up into the air. Blood grows, blood sort of tendons grow between the two halves of the body. They join, and then they pull the top half of the body, the torso, back down to the pelvis and reconstitute it. And there's a splash of blood at the end. And then there's another one where his hand reconstitutes out of liquid blood, and then the skin reveals up over it, and his hand reconstitutes also. And they're very fairly difficult shots to do, even under the best circumstances, and there was not much time in the schedule to do it, and it was an all-out effort, but they turned out great.
You're too late, Blade.
I want to be startled. I want to be dazzled when I go to the movies, and I think that there's huge realms of work that has not been touched. The animation of liquids and unseen mystic forces and dreams, and I don't think that we're anywhere close to realizing that kind of work yet.
I grew up in the 70s and 80s primarily reading Marvel comics. And as I got older, I started reading DC comics. And I think DC comics are written for a slightly more mature audience. One of the reasons why I think so many people are going to comics now as source material is that I've always felt that comic books kind of represent this generation's, Greek heroes. I mean, where do these mythic figures come from? I learned about things like morality and heroism from Spider-Man, from Captain America. I didn't learn it, unfortunately, necessarily from reading a lot of the classics in school. They were from comic books, and after school, we would play on the playground and we'd talk about, well, which superhero do you want to be, and why and how and whose powers, and these characters all. A lot of them, they were all heroic in their own way. They stood for justice, and I think that is where a lot of the modern day archetypes come from now, from these archetypal characters. I mean, Batman and Superman have completely permeated the public consciousness, and I just think that that's the source material for a lot of these heroic figures now. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on the way you look at it, kids tend to gravitate towards those, sources first.
Years ago, there was a great comic book company called EC Comics, and they're the ones who started Mad Magazine, but before that they were doing The Vault of Horror and The Crypt of Terror and books like that. They were really wonderful, but some people objected. They felt they were a little too violent. So the comic book publishers got together and formed an organization called the Comic Book Publishers Association of America, and it was a self-censorship body where they formed some rules of conduct. They're not allowed to have any rape, or they're not allowed to show blood or discuss drugs, things like that. And all the publishers agreed to that. And somehow or other it served to make the books a lot tamer, and eventually EC Comics suspended all their publication, and the only thing they had was Mad Magazine after a while.
Here are some of the things that if you were trying to create a comic book in 1954 that you would not be allowed to do according to the comic book code. In every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. Passion or romantic interest shall never be treated in such a way as to stimulate the lower and baser emotions. Females shall be drawn realistically without undue emphasis on any physical quality. If crime is depicted, it shall be as a sordid and unpleasant activity. Suggestive and salacious illustration or suggestive posture is unacceptable. All lurid and unsavory or gruesome illustrations shall be eliminated. This is a good one. The letters of the word crime shall never be appreciably greater in dimension than the other words contained in the title, the word crime shall never appear alone on a cover. No comic magazine shall use the word horror or terror in its titles. And here's the best one. Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism are prohibited. So as you could see from this, that really eliminated quite a few themes from creating comic books back in the 50s. And even today, a lot of these themes are still not even touched upon.
There was only one time that we had a big problem with the code. I had received a letter from the Office of Health, Education, and Welfare in Washington. This was years ago, and right after Spider-Man became popular, it must have been in the late 60s, maybe the early 70s, I have no memory for dates, but the letter said that recognizing the popularity of Spider-Man with young people, we think it would be great if you would do an anti-drug story in your comics that your young readers could read, and it would do a lot of good. Well, we know better than to just obviously preach to young people, because that's not the way to reach them. But I found a way to do a 3-part Spider-Man story, and within the confines of that plot, we had one of Spider-Man's friends who had taken an overdose of something, and he was standing on a rooftop and he thought he could fly, and it was up to Spider-Man to save him before he jumped, and Spider-Man did and gave him a lecture on what an idiot he was to take whatever drug. I know nothing about drugs. I didn't even know what to call the drug. I just said he took something and he overdosed. But at any rate, the story worked very well, but what happened was when we submitted the book to the comic book code office, they rejected it, these 3 books. And I said, what are you rejecting it for? And they said, according to the code, you're not allowed to mention drugs. And I said, but we're not telling kids to take drugs. It's an anti-drug element in a story. He said, that doesn't matter. According to the code, you cannot mention drugs. Well, I felt that was just so stupid and sophomoric on their part that we took the code symbol off the covers of our books, and we published the books anyway.
I remember reading Tomb of Dracula, which was the Marvel comic that Blade first appeared in. I think he showed up in 72 or 73, and I would have been 7 years old. And I remember going down to the local drugstore and grabbing one of the Tomb of Dracula comics off the spinner, and I just thought Blade was the coolest character I'd ever seen. And I love the fact that he was so much darker and more brutal than Captain America. He just seemed completely different, to inhabit a different kind of world. And I'd always had a fondness for the character, and because of that, I just thought it would translate well to film. He doesn't have a bunch of costumes, and he's got gadgets, but they're all, I mean, it sounds odd to say, but Blade was a much more realistic character, and it's in his own way.
Of course, over the years, comic books have gotten darker anyway, and a lot of them today aren't that dissimilar to the old Tales from the Crypt. We still, over at Marvel anyway, we still try to differentiate between exciting and violent. We try not to make our books violent, but we try to get a lot of excitement and a lot of danger and suspense and things like that. And of course, in our vampire stories like Blade, you get all of that you could ever want.
You know, a successful comic book still has to be well written. People will ultimately turn off to it if it's just eye candy. Even today, even 14-year-olds, it has to be well written. I mean, some of the classic, writers like Alan Moore, I mean, who created Watchmen, he's just an incredible writer. I mean, I think he's a great writer in any genre. He's just a great writer, period, who happens to work in the medium of comic books. Grant Morrison is another writer who's writing the Justice League right now. He's an incredible writer. He's very clever. Frank Miller, who sort of, recreated Batman and Daredevil. I mean, those comics are really, really well written in kind of the Peckinpah tradition. People will turn off ultimately if it's just eye candy. It still needs to be a good story. It still needs to be a mythic story.
See, a strange thing has happened in comics today. Years ago, when we first started Marvel, the age of the readership was about, they'd start with 6 and go up to 12 or 14 or so. And over the years, as we tried to write more intelligent comics and get better vocabularies and concentrate on characterization and on plotting, the age of the readership rose. In fact, after a while, we had as many college readers as young readers. But now, strangely enough, there aren't as many young readers for these comics, which are thought of as children's literature, as there are older readers. If you go to the average comic book store and speak to one of the proprietors, he'll probably tell you most of his customers are over the age of 20. And these darker books that we have now seem to be very appealing to the older readers. I personally think we're going to have to start lightening the books a little, or doing books that are lighter, so we don't lose too many of our younger readers. But right now, this business of darker stories, such as the old Batman, The Dark Knight, which was one of the things that started it, and vampire stories, which we've had for years, and all the heaviness and more earthiness that seems to be in the comics now, while a lot of it represents a lot of good writing, I'm afraid it may be tending to drive away some younger readers, so we have to figure out what to do about that.
In comics, especially back in the early 90s, there has been this anti-code movement where a lot of creators have become very, very outspoken against the code and have really tried to force their books not to fit within the code, and have also tried to force other publishers not to publish within the code. However, especially with the newsstand, the code is very important to retailers because they feel that that's their mark of safety, and that's their way of saying, you know, hey parents, you could buy their books there. But a lot of publishers have been against that, a lot of creators especially.
What we tried to do with Blade was come at all these issues, whether they be racism, whether they be, you know, class system, whether they be, you know, our fears of AIDS, and come at it from this, kind of sneak it in, you know, under the cover of this outrageous, you know, comic book-like movie. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the so-called neo-realistic comic books that are out there now, like 8-Ball and a lot of the things that Drawn and Quarterly are doing. I love those. And actually some of those would make for some great films.
Comic books are really an amazing form of entertainment because unlike a movie or animated show, in a movie you only have 2 hours to entirely capture the audience, or an hour and a half to totally capture the audience. In a comic book, if you don't get it just right, you have time. There's a monthly schedule. You can produce it the next issue or the next issue. You can always make the book better and better over time, or adapt it for things that are going on in the political arena or things that are going on in society and society issues. So it can adapt over time. So comic books have been, in the past, I think, a great representation of what happens in society. So as things have changed in society, comic books can adapt to that, whereas a movie will just take place in a snapshot of time, or an animated show will take place in a snapshot of time, whereas a comic book can evolve. So it can handle a lot more moral and larger issues.
So there's always been within theology the importance of blood as being the source of life, the importance of blood as being life-giving. And certainly that's reflected in both the Old and New Testaments of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible.
Blood is a fluid which has in it many elements. So there is a liquid component of blood and there is a cellular component of blood. The liquid component of the blood has antibodies to fight infection, has the clotting system, and has many other kinds of chemicals, as well as what we call electrolytes, which are atoms that have charge on them. It's the fluid component. The cellular component of the blood is responsible for carrying oxygen, fighting infection, and also providing clotting system. Now, in the human, the red blood cell, the mature red blood cell, sacrifices its nucleus so that the entire red cell can be devoted only to carrying oxygen on hemoglobin. The red cell is very generous because it can't make any more protein after that. It can't even make protein to help sustain itself, which is why the red blood cell dies after about 3 months.
there seems to be throughout vampire lore a very close association between the vampire's need for blood and the story of salvation, where we are saved through Christ's death and his shedding of blood. So I don't think it's any accident that in the older vampire stories, what is it that repels a vampire? It's a crucifix. The sign of Christ giving his life and shedding his blood repels this evil character who's intent upon taking life and stealing blood.
Well, there's certainly a theme that throughout folklore and certainly in early history, that an idea that blood coming into the self could have various kinds of generative and regenerative powers. In folklore, it's much more generative than it is regenerative. But certainly in someone like Elizabeth Bathory, blood brings back youth, brings back health. And blood, just as blood is associated in the face with a flush, that's the sign of health in a young girl. So that blood for Elizabeth Bathory brings back her youth, and Dracula drinks blood and he becomes younger and younger as he is able to consume it. Denial of blood leads to old age. The vampire mythology goes back to the very earliest layers that we have in folklore tradition, 2,000–3,000 years ago, as we start getting literary remains. The vampire is there, and vampire-like characters are there. The earliest vampires are all women, and they are dealing with problems of childbirth. And the Lilith and those different early vampires are all females who've had some problem in childbirth. They've lost their child and they now attack other children. And it seems to be a myth about problems with infants in ancient society. Then the vampire more important function as culture matures is to explain the problems of death. So that anyone who dies an unnatural death, suicide, accident, off at war, those kinds of things, those are potential vampires. And that relates then to the problem of caring for the dead in a culture that has no undertakers and no modern facilities for handling bodies. If someone died, you had to prepare your relative's body for burial.
And you hear stories about times when they would exhume a coffin and open it up and find scratch marks in the lid of the coffin, discovering that this person was presumed to be dead and had been buried but was really alive. And perhaps that has something to do with the origin of the vampire stories, because the vampire, after all, does make his residence in the coffin. He has to return to the coffin, yet he's not really dead, but he's somewhat alive and somewhat dead.
When the vampire moved from being a folklore character to being a literary character, its function changed completely. The vampire first emerged as another form of the monster, the evil creature, the boogeyman who's going to come get you if you don't watch out. And in part, it was a warning to females about the traveling attractive person who wasn't part of the social structure.
Throughout the 19th century, relationships among people were hierarchicalized in terms of family and marriage. And when a vampire expresses affinity and friendship in that culture of the early and mid-19th century, a vampire is most dangerous because affinity undermines class and family relationships. Affinity is sharing. And then what's interesting about vampire lore is that it all changed at the end of the 19th century when Dracula came in. And friendship, at that time was more acceptable in the end of the 19th century and throughout our own century. You were sort of supposed to have friends. And vampires became masters and tyrants and sort of mindfuckers telling you what to be. They became adepts in hypnosis, and they made their victims rather than sharing with them. So again, what really fascinates me and what my book is all about is not the vampire essence, but the vampire changes.
As the vampire has continued to mutate and to develop, he's kind of become a romantic anti-hero.
When I was growing up, I used to watch horror films. I used to watch the double feature on Saturday night. They would run a film from 11 to 1 and one from 1 to 3, and I always used to stay up late and watch those movies. And there was a whole period where all they would show were Hammer films. And there were the Dr. Phibes films, and then there was this oddity, Captain Kronos, Vampire Hunter, Vampire Slayer. And it was this strange hybrid of sort of a vampire film and swashbuckling. There was also a little bit of a Sherlock Holmes in it and a little bit of the Three Musketeers, and it was just this oddity.
When I knew I was going to make a vampire picture, I ran all the Hammer vampire pictures, and I came up with a conclusion that they were all the same, really. The guy you were rooting for, almost the hero figure, was the vampire. The most interesting person in it was the vampire. And you always knew that it was all going to end up with him having a stake through his heart, which seemed to me to be very predictable. And I tried to approach it standing all those conventions on their head and making the actual vampire hunter more interesting, more attractive than the vampire itself. It's a bit like the Avengers in a way, that anything could happen. It was open-ended. Because you never had absolutes, you had the possibility of doing anything. And the same with Kronos. You see, I also invented Dr. Hieronymus Grost, his sidekick, who knew all about folklore and vampire lore. And he has a very important speech that says, vampires can come in any guise, and some of them have to be killed in specific ways that don't include stake through the heart. Hence, there's one long sequence in Captain Kronos where they get a vampire and they put a stake through his heart and then they try and hang him and so on and so forth, until they stumble across the right way of killing him, which is by stabbing him in the heart with holy steel, with a crucifix.
Blade always represented an oddity to me also, in that it sort of infused the whole Shaft vibe with vampires. And as Blade sort of progressed in the Marvel world, they gave him a sword, and it occurred to me that there might be a way to kind of update Captain Kronos in a much more urban, hip way.
The vampire's staying around ability, as opposed to other kind of horror characters, is that the vampire keeps mutating as the culture keeps changing. The vampire keeps losing and absorbing new cultural attributes and moving into new contexts. So the vampire slayer keeps changing and moving into new contexts as well.
And now there seems to be a shift in the way vampirism and vampires are depicted. That's away from the sort of romantic or the romanticist view of the last century and into this century, and it seems to be more almost brutal.
I wanted to make the vampires of Blade not romantic figures at all. I was much more interested in heroin chic vampires. They're not particularly attractive. There's nothing particularly romantic about living forever. They're kind of all scumbags. I was very conscious of wanting to go in a different direction from the kind of Anne Rice sort of subgenre of vampire movies that have been out there.
One of the interesting things about Blade is that Blade culminates a development that really begins to happen in the 1960s, in which the vampire is no longer the lone rogue character that he is even in Dracula. Through most of the 20th century, vampires are single characters. But in the last half of the 20th century, vampires have a society of some type. They're very rudimentary in, say, Matheson's I Am Legend. There's a group of vampires, and the loner is the one guy who's holding out against them.
So going back to the idea that in the 19th century, the pre-Dracula 19th century, the vampire was a friend. And a friend is both somebody who understands you, which family roles don't always, or they preclude it. Now, in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, in America, vampires are gangs. Vampires are branded creatures who are given their identities rather than masters who do the branding. I suppose we both fear and desire submerging ourselves in some sort of mass clan or gang identity. I have to be sort of hesitant on this because when I was young, gangs were West Side Story and they were for boys and girls weren't in gangs. And anyway, it's not anything. I mean, this is where it becomes incomprehensible to me. I think what vampires you like are so personal. And I always wanted to be a transformed creature of the night, but I never wanted to be a gang member. But as a vision of the future, it's as scary as any fanged, snarling monster from the past.
I'm actually truly fascinated, first of all, that Blade did well. And secondly, that it came without really any quasi, even Star Wars scientific background. It's completely the product of our fantasy world. And I think a lot of this is to do is that the world is getting almost unmanageable for a lot of people, and the retreat into fantasy, we've talked about the vampire disco clubs. You have people over there somewhere practicing, Wicca goddess religion, the Burning Man festival out in the desert. There seems to be almost a post-technological neo-paganism.
In theory, we could go back to the Middle Ages. You could have people that are bathing in blood or make blood ointments or blood beauty creams or any kind of crazy thing, because the public will have really no understanding at all. And so it's a great, you can really exploit people when they don't know anything. They see a movie that extols the virtues of the regenerative powers of blood, when used in some crazy way, like with a sprinkler or something like that. And so, that I guess is potentially dangerous because it's a dangerous product.
Centuries and centuries ago, blood was the ichor of life. Some of the vampire legends come from various characters who drank blood, who bathed in blood because they thought it would give them immortality. And unfortunately now people are blood does not represent life. If you go in a hospital and there's a bleed or somebody that's, come in from an accident, a gunshot wound, everybody's scared.
Far from destroying vampire culture, where originally in Dracula, the whole line in Dracula, written 101 years ago, is the blood is the life, the blood is the life, the blood is fortifying, and now the blood is the death. But somebody said that that's restored the sacred power of blood and the holiness. And if blood can kill you, as it does, it's not mere DNA and mere hemoglobin, but it's a sort of mystic, sacred force.
I think there could be a variety of reasons why vampires and vampirism is popular right now. We're on the cusp of a new century and a new millennium, and historically there has always been a heightened interest at the end of a century or at the end of a millennium, heightened interest in things having to do with the ultimate final battle between good and evil. Armageddon, the end of the world, the end of the age, the second coming of Christ, the emergence of the beast, 666, the Antichrist. And the vampire is a sort of an Antichrist because he's juxtaposed to the mission of Jesus, the gospel of Jesus, the message of Jesus.
I think Blade is pervaded, if not by spiritual values, then by religious rituals, much more so than earlier vampire movies.
I saw the vampire apocalypse as being part of this perennial search for the supernatural breakthrough. That if we can only do this little ritual, then the eschaton will come and we will be empowered and the like, which is, to me, an adolescent form of religious faith, but one that continually pops up generation after generation, and that what we were seeing in the movie was sort of an unsophisticated presentation of that apocalyptic faith, though artistically done and integrated to the story.
People always want to cling to legends, and more nowadays, since religion's going out the window, people are turning back to the old wives' tales and the old the anachronisms of alternative medicine and acupuncture and so on. They want the unknown because the known is becoming a bit plebeian, a bit banal, I think.
Well, I think sometimes people have difficulty in trying to have a moral compass, and it shouldn't surprise us if that's reflected in the icons of popular culture.
Well, I think there's an undertow at the end of any century. For some reason, I mean, just really the calendar coming at you, and this one being a millennium as well. I mean, you know, there was a great revival of occultism and spiritualism, table rapping in the 1890s. I think, you know, just in the same way, you know, on New Year's Eve, people get aware of their mortality. At the end of a century, they really get aware of their mortality in spades, and of course, the vampire is immortal, which is one of the reasons I've never been afraid of them, except very early on when I first read Dracula at about 8. But I very then quickly decided that the best deal was to become one.
Blade is much less sophisticated philosophically than some of the other movies that have played to vampirism as an addiction model, or vampirism as some kind of deeper psychological need. It's a good action flick.
And in terms of the film being dumbed down, I mean, this kind of movie, you go for the set pieces, you go for the action. It has a lot of the Hong Kong, it's sort of an ode to the Hong Kong action films. And you know, I read a review of it on the internet that said every once in a while you want to see a movie that's just about kicking ass. This is that movie. And you just have to be very mindful of who are you making this film for, and what do you need to make sure that you deliver on. And for Blade, what you need to make sure you deliver on is the kicking ass more than anything else. And it has to be uncompromising. The character has to be mean. The world that he inhabits has to be mean. I mean, it's sort of, there's, you know, down these mean streets. You have to take that to the nth degree with this kind of movie, or else it's just not true to itself.